I think most people would agree we're in a malaise politically in the US. And how did we get here? What's happening in our spirituality? So looking at some of the spiritual and sociological underpinnings of how we came to this moment where everything seems to be in breakdown.
Welcome to Growing Up Evangelical, conversations on an evolving faith. Each week I'm talking with folks about how the evangelical church shaped their lives in ways good and not so good, and where they find themselves today. If you feel like a church refugee, maybe disappointed or disillusioned with that, but you're still all about Jesus, we are your peeps. Here in this space, you will make sense of your own journey and be inspired toward the next step. Thanks for showing up.
How do we create that sort of appreciation? How do we get people out of the dehumanization of the other side, and into an appreciation? That would be a game changer if we could do that.
It really would. I think that begins to, like, that in itself isn't maybe the third, but that's what allows the potential of a third to even be on the operating table of possibility.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And I'm glad that you said that it's not a compromise. The third way is not a compromise, like you give me this, I'll give you that.
Or I can't have strong beliefs or convictions on the left or the right, because that obviously won't work.
Yeah, because whether we're dealing with our own internal forces, dualities and ternaries, or on the larger scale, we need something fresh, a new way to think, a new way to be. So, and this is where, again, the law of three helps me with the idea that, okay, there's this affirming force and this denying force, and a denying force, not a bad force. It's just sort of like these are the two sides, like Republican and Democrat. And as long as you only have the two, you have stasis, and it's just kind of stuck. But it takes something like a fresh thought, a fresh idea. They call it the law of world creation. They call it, this is where something new emerges that doesn't exist now.
All right.
God knows we need something new besides just this stalemate politically and even spiritually in the world.
I was interviewing John Philip Newell. Are you familiar with?
I am. Love that guy.
Of course you are. I was interviewing him, and I was sort of lamenting the state of our politics. He's over in Scotland, and he had this really interesting take. He said, "Yeah, I get it, but I think we're really in the death knells of something. I think that, and even when a patient, even when a human dies, they often experience that burst of energy at the end." Yeah. And he said, "I really think we're in the death knells of white Christian nationalism and this sort of the bastardization of Christianity into a religion in the pursuit of power." He said, "I think all these things are dying, and right now there's that sort of surge of energy, but I think it's actually a sign that we're close to the end of something dying and something else breaking through." And I find that thought, I don't know if he's right. I hope that he's right. I find it comforting,
Yes.
I hope that's the case.
I hope so too. My personality is not always just naturally optimistic. So it's easy for me to say, well, dang it, we've had empire for a very long time. It's not going to roll over and die. But on the other hand, I think, if we take the big view, that the message of Jesus is of a new heaven and a new earth, and that there is something worth hoping for.
And all will be well.
That all will be well.
Yeah. I think that goes back to the conversation about evangelicalism to me, which was one of the failures of evangelicalism is what I hear you describing is a life where you're participating with the divine in the coming of the kingdom. Now, that's a life that's really exciting. And evangelicalism, I think, was unable to deliver that life of participation because at its core was this transaction. Pray this prayer, you're going to go to heaven when you die. That's the core message.
Yes.
And then on top of that, if you want, there's some things you should do. You should read your Bible and pray and grow. But really in that schema, once you have the fire insurance, once you're going to heaven when you die, all as my friend Bill Hull, used to say, probably still says, all this other stuff becomes optional. The life of transformation, the life of participation becomes optional.
Wow.
In the mystics, like you're quoting, that's part of the relationship, is that transformational dynamic. And so I think evangelicalism largely failed because it did not deliver an invitation to actually participate in, the perichoresis, the divine dance with the Trinity, this transformational process. It was so transactional and reductionist that what you're describing, it just could never deliver. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does.
And I think for a lot of evangelicals at a certain point, it's like, what is the point of this? To go to heaven when I die? I think that's why N.T. Wright's theology has been so helpful for evangelicalism and evangelicals of no, 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 no. This is exactly backwards. This is not about you going to heaven when you die, incanting anemic souls into heaven, to use Wendell Berry's phrase. This is about heaven coming to earth.
Yeah.
It's exactly the opposite of what I was taught. And, I was taught, and this is something that John Philip Newell gets into, I was taught that we are trash and filth, and God can't even stand to look. I'm not being hyperbolic, that
Yeah.
God cannot stand to look at you. He can only do it because of what Christ has done. It's like, I remember thinking, wow, this is a really, now we'd call it a low anthropology, but it's like, I remember just sitting on the gym floor hearing this and thinking, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to feel grateful. I don't feel really grateful. Whereas in Celtic theology and John Philip Newell's theology, it's like, yeah, there's sin, but there's original blessing beneath that. There's this notion that you're made, that God loves you, that he loves to look at you,
Yes.
that he loved you so much that he, redeemed you so that you could be fully participating in the divine life. That is a compelling story. That story could not exist within the evangelical ecosystem that I grew up in.
Yeah.
So, it's probably good that that version of evangelicalism is dying.
Well, I think that it is very, very hopeful. And everything that, that is the cycle of all things. There's a life cycle. Something comes to life, birth, grows up,
Yeah.
then it fades, and then it dies, and then there's a new birth. So I think, the church is always figuring out what it wants to be when it grows up. It's always figuring out how to show up in a new era, in a new time. And so, yeah, I think it is. It's time to let certain things die. I do have dear friends and colleagues who feel kind of called to try to resuscitate the evangelical church. And, there will be fruit in that. But I do feel like ultimately some things they've run their course.
Yeah.
And so if we can return to some of those Celtic roots, mystical roots, even, dare we say, monastic roots, there's so much hope in that. And the divide between, so glad you brought up original blessing in contrast to original sin. These take us such different places.
Yes.
It's just,
Oh my gosh.
the old phrase, you can't get here from there. It kind of feels like it applies like that. Where you begin
Yeah.
is in many ways where you end.
Absolutely.
So we've got to reclaim some of these roots that were sort of lost due to the empire that wove itself into
Yeah.
official Christianity. So tell me, what about this? You talked earlier about an age of outrage, and it's not hard to get angry, especially when the fires are being stoked on all those channels we've talked about. Is there a role for anger? If so, is there something useful, helpful about anger?
Yeah, you made me think of Jesus overturning the tables in the temple. That's a type of anger that obviously was useful. Anger is I work with a lot of my clients on recovering their relationship with anger, because anger is an essential emotion. You can't have a boundary without the right expression of anger, and we need boundaries.
Yeah.
You know, as Edwin Friedman talks about, we need boundaries to, that's what health is, right? Cancer is the breaking down of boundaries and borders. We need borders and boundaries, and the only way to have that in our lives and our emotionally is through the right expression of anger. Robert Masters makes this distinction I find really helpful between, you know, most people when they think about anger, they associate it with rage or violence.
Okay.
So when we talk about anger, for me, we're never talking about rage, we're never talking about violence.
Hmm.
He uses this phrase clean anger, which is anger that allows you to be grounded in yourself and with compassion towards whoever the other person is that you might be angry at, so that you're still holding them as human.
Okay. Yes.
That's a very different paradigm than I think outrage anger that we are being trained into as a society, which is about getting outraged, dehumanizing the other side, which ultimately does lead to rage and violence. So we're kind of like with the word love, we're at some semantic, you know, we're up against some semantic limitations, what we mean when we use these words. Absolutely. I think not only is there a role for anger, um, it's an essential
Yeah.
emotion.
There's something's wrong.
Yes.
That something needs to be addressed. Something is
Yes.
unjust or could be rectified.
Absolutely. When our president, you know, tweets, I'm about to, this is just from this week, when we're recording this, we're going to bring a civilization to an end. You know, I can't remember the exact words of his tweet about Iran, but it's like,
Annihilation, I think, was maybe a word in
yeah,
there.
it's like, okay, that is the right response to that is a type of anger, is that's profanity. That is something profane being set up in the temple. And then how to have that anger and have it be pure without going into the victimization cycle,
Hmm.
without dehumanizing the other side, without dehumanizing, you know, Donald Trump. How do you do that? I think that's the real tension of the way of Christ.
There's another term that I picked up in one of your podcasts. You used the term moral imagination.
Part of what I witness in our society, and especially even evangelicalism, is the reduction of a moral imagination, which means that we accept things that are clearly immoral and we normalize them. So to put this in the evangelical context, I was in the heart of the Bible Belt when Bill Clinton was doing all sorts of things in the in the Oval Office, and rightfully immoral, and rightfully he was um, chastised. Not rightfully immoral, but immoral, and he was rightfully chastised.
Yes.
You would have thought it was the end of Western civilization from where I sat. I mean, the gnashing of teeth, you know, the ripping of cloth, that our president would do this, and and I think that's, you know, a fair critique for what Clinton did with an intern. Fast forward to Donald Trump grabbing women by the genital. I mean, I could cite all sorts of behavior.
Yeah.
Total crickets, total silence.
Yeah.
Well, we're not hiring a pastor. You know, we're not electing a pastor. We're electing a president. And that I already saw the bankruptcy of evangelical morality, but that's really what brought it home for me was, oh, this was never about morality. This was always about power. This was always about feeling the emotional payoff of having the moral high ground. It was never actually about demanding true morality. And I think that's what has damned evangelicalism is the the largely complete failure to have a prophetic voice in the midst of Donald Trump's clear, um, egregious moral behavior. So the failure of a moral imagination is being invited to accept and normalize things and justify behavior, a prophetic voice that critiques. Even if you voted for Donald Trump, to say, hold on,
Yeah.
this and this and this is unacceptable. It's unacceptable when someone dies to say I celebrate their death. It's unacceptable when Rob Reiner dies to make light of it and to say that he had Trump derangement syndrome. I mean, this crazy behavior that that people don't critique. And because they're so caught in the tribal A or B. This, what's at the heart of the failure of a moral imagination is letting the system, the A or B, do the thinking for us. So, to bring it back to the third way, the only way to claim a moral imagination is to say, hold on, I'm not going to take the party line over here or over here. I'm going to critique both sides according to a moral standard that is independent of I just accept what is Democrat or Republican and reject the other side. I think that's what I was speaking to on the podcast. I don't totally remember the context.
Yeah. Let's recap. We live in a world of dualities, and I think in some sectors, that worked great. Math, dualities, binaries works just fine. But when you come to anything relational or spiritual or transcendent, we need something far more advanced than that. This is like trying to take a Swiss watch, which this is not, and you try to repair it with a hammer. You can't do it. This is delicate machinery. Whether we're talking about our own hearts, very delicate machinery, all of those parts and managers and firefighters and this is what we have though. Like we have
Precision tools.
precision tools. Thank you. We have precision tools. And I think in the way of Jesus, we have everything we need in order to be transformed and to find a way that is where we really do become. There is a new arising within us individually, a new arising within the community of faith, a new arising, God help us, in the political sphere, on the global playing field that is just so heartbreaking. But we have been entrusted with third way precision tools, and we have to do the work. And it begins in us. It begins with doing our own personal work, and then we can carry that outward.
And for me, I think a central part of this conversation is this unitive centrist way. Again, in Jesus's disciples, right, the zealot and the tax collector, completely opposing forces.
Yeah.
And yet the human longing represented in what Jesus represents is the connection point where they both need, something they see in another. For us to have a unitive centrist approach to other human beings, and that they have something we need, no matter how different than they are from us. And for in our politics, to recognize the other side has something that we need. If we can grasp that, it'll help us get out of this kind of either or scorched earth politics that's taken over, where, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, they used to be fierce political enemies, but they could have whiskey together and talk about their differences. You can't imagine Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi doing it, right? It's not possible to imagine that because of how we've progressed into this. No, it's either or. It's another type of purity culture.
Yeah.
That's ideological purity. Only the Republicans are pure, only the Democrats. It's all, bull roar. It's a lie. We have to reject that lie and recover a unitive centrist way of thinking. And our culture is not training us into that. So it's going to take people who, pick up the banner for that and show that there's a way between the false binaries.
Unitive centrism. That will be my takeaway from our conversation today. My dear friend, thank you for...
That's so fun. Thank you for having me.
Just totally enjoyable. Even talking about heavy themes, there's a sense of hope and purpose and possibility here that we desperately need to hear.